We're in the middle of a section of the Kuzari where Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is providing us with proof about the authenticity of the accounts of the Torah, the historical accounts of the Torah. What the Torah says happened about creation and about a flood and about a dispersion of mankind because of an incident of a tower in Babel, somewhere in Mesopotamia. So all of these things are accurate based upon the likelihood or the plausibility that these things are the way that Moshe reported them, because otherwise people would have been able to refute them. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is going to take a different line of argumentation for the authenticity of the account of the Torah. And this argumentation is going to be based upon an observation that he makes about the conventions that human beings have when it comes to days of the week and when it comes to a numerical system, whereas by languages we have no convention, we have no consensus. And before I go into the details of this proof, I guess it's worthwhile to point out that the whole world of logic and proofs that existed in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's world was very different from the world of scientific proof that we talk about in today's world. If you want to be able to prove something scientifically in today's world, you have to bring it to the laboratory and be able to provide empirical evidence. This is a methodology that did not become popular until somewhere around the 17th century. Before that time, if you wanted to prove something was true, then you did it based upon argumentation, purely based on logic. This was the way that people, great mathematicians and scientists like Aristotle, were able to come up with their own understanding of the way that the universe worked. They didn't use telescopes because they didn't have telescopes. They used certain levels of observation. In other words, they observed certain motions of the planets and the stars, and they came up with a system that was consistent with their observations, but was not necessarily provable in a laboratory. And so this is the world in which Rabbi Yehuda Halevi lives. And that's why we shouldn't be surprised that so much that Aristotle has written about astronomy has proven to be completely false. Someone just showed me that there's a website for an organization called the Flat Earth Society. Have you ever heard of this, the Flat Earth Society? There's still a very small group. It's getting a group that's becoming smaller and smaller as we speak, of people who still argue that the whole presentation that the Earth is round is really this tremendous hoax that has been put on us by a group of people that have some kind of insidious agenda. And really the world is flat. Now that's ridiculous. But if you were living at a time before exploration, before people had the opportunity to go up in space and send up a satellite and take photos of the world, to even use telescopes, then it was perfectly reasonable to assume that the world was flat. And you weren't being foolish, you weren't being unintelligent in putting forward that argument. All of the observations that people made in the ancient and medieval world pointed to the fact that the world was flat, because all you saw was a horizon on one end of the sky and a horizon on the other end of the sky, and there was nothing beyond that. So there was nothing unreasonable or foolish or naive about that theory, because we just simply didn't have instrumentation to prove it. So if you find that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is putting forth an argument based upon his observation of the way the world is today, he's not being naive, he's not being gullible, he's presenting a mode of argumentation that was the way that all philosophers and scientists put forth their argumentation. So the argumentation that we're going to see now is an observation of the way the world is today. We look at all of humanity and we make an argument based upon how we see people conducting themselves. We see that the world is completely at consensus when it comes to numbering our days of the week. There's no such thing as one country having an 8-day week and another country having a 5-day week, and only one segment of civilization having a 7-day week. Isn't that strange that we all manage, when it comes to the management of time, we all seem to manage our time the same way. We all have 12-hour days or 24-hour days, depending upon whether you divide the day between day and night, or whether you look at the day as a whole day and night unit. By the way, there is no convention on certain kinds of things when it comes to time. There is no convention as to the beginning of the day. In Judaism, the day begins in the evening. Other civilizations have the day begin at midnight. Other civilizations, actually, there was an ancient Egyptian cult that used to begin the day at noon, or some begin in the morning at sunrise. So there's no convention as to actually what we would call the new day, but everyone nevertheless agrees that there's a concept called a day, a unit called a day, and the week is 7 days. No one disagrees about a 7-day week. That's at least his contention. Here's another thing where there's absolute convention. Everyone arrives at the same conclusion. We have a decimal numeric system. Everyone from east to west counts the same way. We go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And when we get up to the number that comes after 9, we start all over again. And we start with a 1 and a 0 instead of some other symbol which would be unique. So that's called the decimal system of counting. And that seems to be arrived at consensus. No one has a hexadecimal system. No one in the world, in the ancient world. No one has a binary counting system where you only count up to 0. You start with 0, then you go to 1, and then you start counting 1, 0, right? People, computers work that way, using binary code, but people don't count that way. There's no civilization that only counts up to 8 and then starts all over again. So how do we arrive? Am I making sense? So how do we arrive at a decimal system that there's absolute consensus throughout the world that we all count the same way? We don't have consensus when it comes to alphabets. We don't have consensus when it comes to language. But we have consensus when it comes to counting. So some want to argue that it's got to do with the number of fingers that you have on your hand. And that would make a lot of sense. That would make a lot of sense, assuming that everyone counts. Why not have a system where people just count on one hand and then start all over again? Well, maybe you're hunting with one hand, or you're writing with one hand. So we have a consensus when it comes to the days of the week. We have consensus when it comes to counting. And then with other things, we don't have consensus. And so this is what piques Rabbi Yehuda Levi's curiosity. And it says that we can use, through inductive reasoning, we can look back and say that these things are indicators as to how human civilization developed. And we will find that it is consistent with the way that the Torah reports how the world came into being and how human beings came into being and how civilization dispersed from one central point. The thesis is going to be, of course, that the reason why there's consensus for several kinds of things like counting and like days of the week is because we do all come from one, all of humanity originates from one community, and then we splintered off. Now he's going to present us with another argument in just a second, and we're going to have to sort of think about his line of reasoning and see if it resonates with us. It has to do with language. It has to do with the question of how did multiple languages begin? Now, if I were to ask you, let's say you're an anthropologist, you're an armchair anthropologist, and you were to observe that there are multiple languages throughout the world, how would you theorize that different languages began? How is it that different people began to communicate in different ways? Anyone want to speculate how that happened, that different people in different countries? How is it that French people started speaking French, and Anglos began speaking English, or some early dialect of that language? How is it that happened? Especially if you're dealing with countries that have, or Germans started speaking Germans. You have nations that live right next to each other, and yet they find different modes of communication. And would anyone like to speculate how these things happen? Yes?
Well, in linguistics, there are families of languages that you can trace back. For example, most Western languages are developed from an Indo-European root. As tribes and groups of people moved, they split apart and they changed the way they spoke. The theoretical, they've never actually found evidence because it's
prehistoric, yeah.
But they gradually pronounce things differently. Look at the difference between Quebec French and French French.
Yes.
And English comes from both Norman French and German. And so there are families of languages.
Yes.
They have never been able to get all the way back to the original language. Was there an original language, or were there several spontaneous developments of original languages in Africa and Asia? In the Indo-European languages apparently developed somewhere around North India.
Yeah.
But the original language, which you can trace some of them back by showing how the words change.
Yeah.
But the original language has never been postulated.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listen. If I was an anthropologist and I had no knowledge of the way languages originated, I would have said like this. I would have said that originally we were all cavemen or cave people. I don't mean to discriminate. And we were all just grunting to each other. Ooga. Right? And then all of a sudden, someone didn't understand me when I wanted them to pass me a spoon. Assuming, maybe there probably weren't any spoons back then, but I wanted someone to pass me a rock, right? So originally I would just hit him over the head in order to make sure that he understood me. And finally I realized that there must be a different way of communicating besides hitting him over the head, that I want that rock over there. So I went over to the rock and I said, but then I realized that, that's the same word that I use for my wife. So I've got to figure out another way. So I finally came up with some kind of noise that was different from the other noise that I use for my wife. And that's how I was able to indicate that I was referring to a rock. Okay? So that's probably how different sounds began to form. But you have to assume that, we come from people who were completely illiterate, and we arrived at certain conventions because there must have been some tribal leader who needed to communicate his wishes, and he passed on these ideas to the other people of his clan or of his tribe. And as civilization dispersed, different languages developed because of different conventions. That's what I would guess is probably what happened if we come from cavemen. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is going to make an argument that's almost the opposite of what I've just suggested, and I want us to think about whether it makes sense to us. So let's take a look. We're on page 79, paragraph 53. So let's get someone close to the camera. Someone from these two tables. Sip, you want to read for us today? Go ahead.
What paragraph?
53.
The rabbi said, "Let me present another point. Do you believe that all languages have always existed?" The Kuzari responded, "Of course not. Each language began at some point in history by mass consensus of some sort. The proof of this is that each language is made up of nouns, verbs, and other types of words. Each word was formed from the different sounds of the letters with some intelligent masterminding." The rabbi said, "Fine. Have you ever seen or heard of any people developing a new language to replace their old one?" The Kuzari said, "No, I have not. Obviously then, when different languages began, it was at a time when there weren't any different languages among the nations. Everyone must have been speaking one language before that point."
Right. He's making an assumption, and the assumption is that human civilization was originally not dispersed, but that people were all together at some point, which is a reasonable assumption to make if we talk about humanity arising from one family. I think that anthropologists would have to acknowledge the same thing, that we see a migration pattern starting in the Middle East and branching out into different parts of the world from the Middle East. At least one segment of humanity, at least what we would call Western civilization. So if that's the case, then how did different languages morph? Or there must have been something that created a transformation. If everyone was together, everyone must have been speaking one language before that point, he says. And he says, if you take a look at footnote 51, I try to spell out the language. He says, the logic is as follows. It does not make sense for a nation that already has its own unique language to decide to change it at the spur of the moment. Therefore, we are led to the conclusion that prior to the formation of individual languages, each nation did not have its own unique language. So what emerges is that previously there was one universal language, and that some event in history forced each nation to acquire its unique language. There was nothing that compelled all the different nations of the world to adopt their own unique language. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is making several assumptions. Number one, everyone was living together at some point. They dispersed, and something happened to cause them to choose a unique language for themselves. Why would a nation choose its own unique language if there was already an accepted convention of communication? Why would we decide to change that convention? That doesn't seem to be logical. So there must have been something traumatic that happened on a mass scale to force people to change their accepted convention, their accepted norm. And this, he says, is the argument to prove or to make plausible that the story of the Tower of Babel occurred the way that it did in the Torah. This is the argument. If everyone was originally communicating in one way, and then we all spread out, why would we start communicating differently? So that's the argument that he wishes to make. Again, he's not taking into account that we may have dispersed before we were even communicating verbally. That he's not taking into account. The assumption that he's making is that people were communicating verbally at a very early point. And if people were communicating verbally, then there's no rhyme or reason why different languages would start to develop. There would have to be at least some connection to all languages that would make them at least connectable all to each other. And that we don't see. So this proves that there must have been some unique phenomenon, probably some kind of phenomenon that was foisted upon human civilization that forced languages to become diverse when originally there was one language. Now, this may or may not be the case. In other words, from a logical standpoint, one could say, well, I either subscribe to that or I don't subscribe to that. I buy into that argument or I don't. I think a modern-day anthropologist would look at this and say that there's certain assumptions that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is making here that are not necessarily accurate. Like I just said, maybe mankind dispersed before we were communicating with words, in which case it would make a lot of sense for Chinese and French to develop completely differently and have no commonality whatsoever. And then Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's argument is out the window. So I want you to bear that in mind. We're not obligated to accept every argument that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi makes. We have to look at the totality. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi himself says this at one point in the Kuzari. He says, look, if you find one thing about the Torah that you find unsatisfactory, you can't allow the one thing that you find problematic for you to unravel the entire structure. You have to look at the structure in its totality. And if the structure in its totality seems sound and seems logical and seems plausible, then you can't use one thing that you say, well, this doesn't make sense to me, and completely topple the whole system. If we find that this particular argument doesn't resonate with us because maybe based on modern anthropology, we have a different conception of how civilizations spread out throughout the world, so fine. I mean, to say that he's making an assumption based upon the story of creation, that when God created Adam and Eve, he was already communicating with them, is a circular argument. Because what Rabbi Yehuda Levi is trying to argue is that without looking at the Torah itself for any evidence, we can prove that the stories of the Torah are accurate based upon our observation of how language is formed. So we would argue and say, no, not necessarily. If we didn't have the story of creation and the flood and the Tower of Babel as it's presented in the Torah, we could have come up with a different theory as far as how language is spread. But now that we do have the story of Migdal Bavel in the Torah, we can accept that God played a role in causing different peoples to communicate in different ways. Now let me throw out another suggestion, which I hope you won't find too out there, too heretical. But I don't think that it's a stretch to suggest that the entire story of the Tower of Babel may be an allegory for something different that occurred, and the Torah presents it to us in the way of the story of a group of people that were living in the plains of Shinar and decided to build a structure that would go up to heaven and challenge God. Because if we submit that ultimately Hashem is running the entire world, and Hashem choreographs the entire framework of human history, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have orchestrated in a much more natural way how it is that different nations formed, each nation having its unique language. Even if the story of the Tower of Babel is not exactly the way that the Torah records it, even if, for example, it didn't happen that one day everyone was speaking Hebrew, and then God snapped his fingers and that guy was speaking Latin, and that guy was speaking Chinese, and that guy was speaking Turkish, and so forth, even if it's not the way that the Torah explains it exactly, the message of the Torah is still the same. There's a very profound lesson that the Torah is teaching us, is that God deliberately created segments of humanity because it was better for the world, for mankind to be splintered in some way, than it was for all of us to be one nation. And that's counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive that God would want humanity to be splintered, because after all, shouldn't we all just get along? Shouldn't we all be united? That's Le'iloi Nishmas Rabbi King, who was just nifter. Shouldn't we all be just one group of people? Shouldn't we all be united? Isn't it better from God's perspective that mankind be one, a cohesive, unitary group? And the lesson of the Torah is, of course it would be better. If man was perfect, it would be better for man to be unified. But because of man's imperfections, when you bring all of mankind together, you end up with a recipe for disaster. And that's precisely what happened in the story of the Tower of Babel. And so what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did is that he orchestrated, through some, perhaps a very slow evolutionary process, not necessarily at the snap of the finger the way the Torah describes, but through a slow evolutionary process, he created a migratory pattern and some kind of a series of events that caused tribes to depart from one another and to travel to the four corners of the earth. We don't really know, and it's not, because this is not one of the fundamentals of our faith, there's nothing wrong with suggesting that it didn't happen exactly the way that the Torah says, because sometimes when we talk about the very early stories of the Torah, it is possible that the Torah speaks to us in a more metaphoric form instead of us taking every single event that the Torah describes literally. Now we have to be very careful with that. Obviously there's potential danger. There was an entire school of medieval religious thinkers who even suggested that the stories of Avraham, Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and Rachel and Leah were also metaphorical, and that these people never really existed. And that seems quite clear that the Rishonim categorically rejected that kind of very hyper-metaphorical interpretation of the Bible. That's not acceptable. Once we get into the story of the formation of the Jewish people, we're obligated to accept the fact that the characters that the Torah describes for us as the original Jews lived the way that the Torah describes them, and that they were real people. But it is possible that before we get into the stories of Avraham and Sarah and their progeny, it is possible that the Torah will sometimes speak in a more metaphorical tone. So we need to keep that in mind. So even if we find this anthropologically dissatisfying, let's also accept the fact that it's okay. We can live with that as well. But let's observe something quite interesting. What Rabbi Yehuda Levi is creating for us now is a contrast. He's telling us that on the one hand, there's no convention in the way that people communicate to each other verbally, but on the other hand, there are certain modes of convention, and it doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. So go ahead, please. Paragraph 57.
The rabbi said, moreover, have you ever heard of any nation that opposes the standard 7-day week that begins on Sunday and ends on the Sabbath? Is it logical to suggest that each nation, from the easternmost to the westernmost, arrives independently at the 7-day week without any initial collaboration? The Kuzari said, you are right. The only way that this could occur is by all nations getting together at some point and agreeing upon it. But this is too far-fetched, unless we say that at some point in history, all people descended from one person, either Adam or Noah or someone else, so that all people acquired their knowledge of a week from the same parents.
And so this, of course, is the point. He wants to be able to prove the point that we all come from the same source. Even though we have different languages, but that was because of a traumatic phenomenon that was orchestrated by God. But when it comes to the days of the week, when it comes to a 7-day week, the very fact that there's mass consensus from everywhere, from east to west, no matter what language we speak, we still have 7 days of the week, that proves that we all come from one unified, one original source. Continue on paragraph 59, please.
The rabbi said, that is what I wanted to hear. Another example of this is the fact that all people, from the east to the west, agree on a decimal-based numeric system. Why would there be a natural gravitation to the number 10 unless it started with one individual who taught it to all his children?
Okay, and this is a good place for us to stop. And we'll take a break here, and we'll resume with paragraph 60 when we get back to the Kuzari after a recess of several weeks. But again, the idea of a numbering system where the whole world arrives at consensus using the number 10 could either be because of something having to do with the fingers, the digits of our fingers. But, says Rabbi Yehuda Levi, it's more likely, because that's only one theory, it's more likely that it had to do with the fact that we all counted the same way at some point. We all come from the same family. Okay. Ad kan.